We start with a question about the legitimacy of the words Byzantine or Byzantium as describers of what we are studying. Byzantium is the old name of Constantinople. It was established in about the 7th century BC as Byzantion, a Greek settlement on the Bosphorus. It was only changed to Constantinople when, of course, Constantine the Great decided that he would build his new capital there. As far as the legitimacy of the name Byzantium is concerned, that is a matter of argument. There are some Facebook groups which will expel you if you use the B word. They regard Byzantium as some kind of term of hideous abuse that must be suppressed by all means short of legal penalty. I can't see what's wrong with it. Or rather, I can see what's wrong with it. There are some people who say that this is a term of denigration made up since about the Renaissance, certainly since the 18th century, by Western scholars which simply want to airbrush the history of that particular empire out of the books. What they want to do is to say that the Greeks were glorious, they gave way to the Romans, who together with the Greeks were glorious, who gave way to the barbarians, the Western barbarians that is, and that since then the Western barbarians, the Greeks and the Romans are all glorious, and it's a long and continuous line of history. And then they say, oh, and there's those degenerate Greek things at the far end of the Mediterranean. Let's not look at those. We need to pay attention to them only so far as things like the reign of Charlemagne or the Crusades come to our attention, but otherwise there is nothing there to learn. These are the degenerate Byzantines, which is, of course, a false view of history, and I can understand that some people will insist that no, we must call this the Eastern Roman Empire, or we must call it the Medieval Roman Empire, to put it back into the standard history. As I said, I can understand that that is a perfectly legitimate desire. It's just that some people have taken it over with all the fervour of converts, and there are people who've seized on terms like the Medieval Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, with all the fervour of the Richard III society. There is an obvious difference of tone between the Roman Empire of Constantine, shall we say, and the empire of Basil II. Basil II may call himself the Roman Emperor. He may trace his institutional lineage back to Augustus and Julius Caesar, but he is not, in the sense that we would quite understand, a Roman. He is an Orthodox Christian whose first, indeed only language, is Greek, and who has never visited Rome. To what extent should he be called a Roman? And the answer comes back because he says he's a Roman, and because the Greeks themselves, until well into the 19th century, called themselves the Romans, and when the Turks conquered the territory of modern Turkey, and indeed the territory of modern Greece, they called their subjected Christians Romans, and the Turkish Sultan took for himself the title of Roman Emperor after the capture of the city in 1453, so make of that what you will. No one who has any right to be offended by the term Byzantium is alive, and so it is simply a matter of descriptive convenience whether you use it or avoid it. This being said, here is the main lecture. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this 7th session of our Byzantine Empire course. Today, and it will be rather a long set of slides, but today our general theme is recovery. Not decline, not ever shrinking borders, but recovery. And a good place to begin the recovery, though it's not the only place where you could begin it, but a fairly good place to start the recovery, is the reign of Irene, the empire's only woman emperor. Not an empress, because obviously most emperors contrived to have wives, and the emperor's wives were usually rather powerful women, but an empress, a woman who rules the empire without any husband and without any son to provide some fig leaf for her rule. Irene is the only woman who ruled the empire in her own right, not as the empress, but as the emperor. An interesting woman, no doubt. These are her basic details. She lived for 50 years, which is slightly above average for the age, though it is depressingly short by today's standards. She was born in Athens into what is described as an important local family. She is not a member of the long-term nobility of the empire, if indeed you can speak of such a thing. It seems that between about the 7th and the 10th centuries, families did not last for very long, or rather, family histories did not last for very long. Somebody would establish a name for himself, he would pass that on to his sons, who might pass it on to their grandsons. The family would then sink into obscurity and replaced by another, a continual circulation of elites. You do not, in this period, have a long-lasting nobility, anything like the senatorial aristocracy, which, although continually replenished and continually dying out, lasted in its essentials from about the 7th century BC down to about the 6th centuries AD. A very long-lasting aristocracy, and although continuously replenished, also continuously linked by marriage to the existing but dying out families. So there is no long-term nobility during this phase of the empire's history. So Irene is born into a well-to-do family in Athens, and she is born into what is now a fully Christian state with Greek as its official language. This empire, and have a look at the map of it here on the bottom right of the slide, this is an empire which is a rump, a fragment of the empire that was ruled by Constantine or even by Justinian. It is confined to the territories of what is now modern Turkey and part of Greece, plus many of the Mediterranean islands and a little bit here and there of Italy. It's lost 2/3 of its territory, including Egypt. The great constellation of cities that was the empire until well into the reign of Justinian has vanished. Those cities, as I explained last week, have either disappeared or they have dwindled into the status of walled villages. And Constantinople itself, within those vast defensive walls, is largely given over to farming land, and the ceremonial centre may also have been largely or partly in ruins. There is hardly any family in Constantinople which has roots more than 3 generations deep, and Latin. Latin is an unknown language for the most part. It is a language known to a few scholars and to those diplomats who have to deal with the Pope and the Western barbarians. It is not a language spoken in any of the core territories of the empire. This is the empire into which Irene is born. But although it is a much diminished empire, it is also an empire that is on the road to recovery. Remember that climate is one of the determinants of history. It is not the determinant. How we choose to respond to a particular change in climate is a matter for our own particular balance of inclinations and abilities. But there is no doubt that changes in the climate present certain challenges or opportunities, or both at the same time, that it is then up to us to respond to. And after about 700, that sharp and sudden and, at the time, apparently bottomless fall in global temperatures reverses itself and temperatures begin to rise. Have a look at this diagram on the top right of the slide. What you can see there is variation around an average, variation around a mean temperature. You can see that from about 600 there is a sharp downward trend in temperatures. This reaches a low point around 700, then begins to rise, and it rises and rises until we reach what is called the medieval warm period. Because we do not have any means of direct measurement, the question of when this warming period started and the question of from what it started and where to it went simply can't be answered. It depends on which particular set of measurements you apply, but there is no reasonable doubt that from about 700 AD, the world, or at least the part of the world that is important to us at the moment, is entering one of its warming phases. This means longer growing seasons, it means better harvests, it also means after about 750 an end to visitations of the plague. The plague appears to be something that visits during the cooling phases. Outside of those cooling phases, bubonic plague vanishes from most of the Eurasian landmass. Because of these rising temperatures and improvements in harvests, and because of the decline of the plague, which has been an anchor on population, there is also a growth of population. Because there is a growing population, there is a recovery of trade, although again we are unable to speak directly of what happened. We can say that the city of Constantinople is beginning to fill up again within its ancient walls. The Golden Horn is dredged around 750 so that it can fill again with ships from all over the Mediterranean. There is also the beginning of more settled relations with the northern barbarians, who are beginning to convert to Christianity. Indeed, they are beginning to convert to Orthodox Christianity. The Arabs, we last saw the Arabs last week when they were seen off with Greek fire. That doesn't mean that the Arab threat has disappeared. It means that after 717, the Arab threat is no longer existential. But as the century wears on, the Arabs become increasingly less important. They remain a substantial nuisance, but they are not a clear danger to the empire's existence. So the empire is beginning to recover, and it is a new kind of empire in this age of renewed economic and urban expansion. It is no longer the Imperium Romanum. It is no longer anything that Augustus or Constantine or even Justinian would have recognized. It is a new kind of empire. You could perhaps call it a middle kingdom, an economic and social bridge between Islam and the East and a reviving West. You can see the scale of the recovery from this Italian case study. In the past 5 years, the archaeologists have been looking in detail at the land in this part of southern Italy shown in the box in the slide at the bottom right. By looking closely at pollen samples and looking very closely at foundations and, generally speaking, looking at how the land was used at particular times in the past, it is possible to see that during the 8th century, after a long period of falling population, the area has stabilised and is beginning to experience rising populations. We can also see the re-emergence of agricultural production on a large scale and the re-emergence of a cash economy. Suddenly, coin finds multiply in numbers. We can see the building of kilns, and these are important because you need pottery factories to produce the pots for carrying olive oil, wine, and other products to the main markets of the empire. Indeed, looking at how the land was used at various times in the past, it is possible to say that by about 750, 800, this southeastern tip of Italy is enjoying greater prosperity than at any time since the 1st and 2nd centuries. In the literary evidence, in the history of Liutprand of Cremona, for example, you can see evidence of growing pirate trades from North Africa. You might say that this is a sign of continuing weakness, that the Italians are unable to defend themselves, and it may be taken as a sign of weakness. At the same time, it is a sign of growing prosperity. Pirates only raid peoples who have something worth stealing, even if it's just their bodies. Wealth attracts criminals, and so the greater the number of criminals, it could be the greater the number of things that are worth stealing. So you can take these micro-studies of southeastern Italy as evidence for a general recovery in at least the eastern Mediterranean. But let's come back to Irene. In 768, when she is 16, Irene is brought from Athens to Constantinople. She is brought to take part, we suspect, in a bride show. And this was a rather strange custom in Constantinople. The emperor wants a wife for his son, especially for his son and heir, so he will go around the empire and bring in all of the eligible young women. These will be lined up. His son will then move up and down the line, sometimes stopping, asking a question, sometimes hurrying on. But the idea is that he will find somebody to marry. The emperor's son chooses Irene, so she is married to the emperor's son. In 771, she gives birth to the future Constantine VI. 775, the emperor dies. Her son is crowned Leo VI with Irene as empress. Now, have a look at that slide on the right. I did say at the beginning that I would talk a lot about religion, but I haven't mentioned the iconoclast controversy, partly because it's very difficult to see what the fuss was about. My understanding is that the great success of Islam had a certain amount of influence within the empire. After the last serious Arab attack was driven off, the emperors decided, for whatever reason, that the success of the Caliphate and the relative weakness of the empire could be largely explained by the fact that the Muslims had a prejudice against the use of religious representational art, and the empire's churches were filled with icons and mosaics. The judgment of God was on the empire, and the judgment of God was solidly against the use of representations of the holy persons. Therefore, the emperor and a substantial number of others within the empire began a campaign to strip the churches of their icons and their mosaics. This led to an immediate explosion of outrage from large sections of the church and from the population at large. It also led to condemnations by the Pope, who had no particular objection to the use or the disuse of these images, but he did not believe that they should be disused simply because an emperor, or indeed even because a council convened by the emperor and controlled by the emperor, should say that images should be disused. So you have a long-running religious controversy within the empire. Leo VI does not like the use of images. Irene is favourable to the use of images. She is an iconophile. In 780, after a few years of relative tolerance, Leo takes a much harder line against icons. He dies almost at once. The rumour is that he's been poisoned by his wife. Could well be. Because at once, Irene takes power as regent for her son. He's only 9, so he needs a regent. Irene's way of consolidating her power is the standard way. You get rid of anyone who stands in your way or is likely to stand in your way. So almost her first act is to remove all of Leo's brothers from positions of importance. There's 5 of them, and every one of them is removed from positions of importance and tonsured and ordained as priests, because once you've been ordained as a priest, you are for all secular purposes dead. And just to make sure that everyone knows that these 5 men have been forcibly enrolled within the church, they are made to celebrate Mass in Hagia Sophia on Christmas Day in 780 in front of the people of Constantinople. Worth noting, killing of enemies has gone out of fashion, not moderately out of fashion. There is not a vague prejudice against killing political enemies. It now appears to be part of the empire's settled constitution that you do not kill enemies and that you apply the death penalty for any purpose whatever very sparingly. The preference is to get rid of political opponents by forcible ordination, or if that doesn't work, you blind them or cut their ears off or mutilate them in some other way. It sounds unpleasant, but it is a great deal more pleasant than cutting their heads off. Irene replaces her 5 brothers-in-law and all of their various clients and allies by her own people, and most notable of these are Tarasius, who becomes the Patriarch of Constantinople, and Stauratius, or Stauracius, however you wish to pronounce it. He's a eunuch, and he's appointed her Foreign Secretary and Chief General. Irene has a number of projects which she carries steadily forward through her reign. The first is to end the official war on icons. She believes in their power. She also finds that she has the support of many important people within the empire, not least people who are important simply because of their numbers. In 784, she summons a council of bishops, an ecumenical council, but the army is full of iconoclasts and it demonstrates and prevents the council from meeting. Irene smiles, withdraws the invitations, and then in 787 she declares a fake war on the Arabs, sends the army off to the borders, and while the army's off looking for an enemy to fight, she reconvenes the 7th Ecumenical Council at Nicaea. There's a formal condemnation of iconoclasm, and this has the full approval of the Greek and Latin churches. It is the last church council that has the complete agreement of both Greek and Latin churches. There is a gold solidus of Irene beside her son Constantine VI. There is a 15th century fresco of Irene and her son presiding over the final session of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. That is the first part of Irene's mission complete. She has ended the iconoclast dispute. This is a dispute which does not completely end. It will rumble on for another 50 years, but it is effectively over. The second part of her project is the reconquest of Greece, the expansion of the empire back into the Balkans. Most of the Balkans, from about 600 onwards, first of all, the northern Balkans are lost to barbarian tribes, and then most of Greece is lost. I have discussed this. It is a matter of some controversy, not helped by the somewhat intemperate statements of 19th century German historians that the modern Greeks were in no sense the heirs of the ancient Greeks. But the point that these German scholars were making is not entirely unsound. What we do see, or at least what we do appear to see, is the invasion of the historic territories of Greece by Slavic barbarians, the invasion and the settlement of Greece by Slavic barbarians, and we appear to see a progressive disappearance of the Greek-speaking population. Is this because the Greeks have been killed, or they've died out, or they have migrated to Asia Minor? Is it because they have, for whatever reason, assimilated themselves into the Slavic language and culture? Or is it that the Greeks have withdrawn to certain parts of the country without any great loss of numbers, and that the country is now divided between Greek and Slavonic populations? We don't know. We don't know because we don't really know what's going on in that part of the world. What we can say is that large parts of inland Greece are no longer controlled by the empire. Irene's plan is that the whole of Greece should be reconquered, it should be re-Hellenized and reconverted, and that gradually, or that eventually, this project of reconquest should move further and further north, right up until the borders of the empire are again placed on the southern shores of the River Danube. The Arabs are contained, and I'll say no more than that. This is the Caliphate, this is the Abbasid Empire. Around the year 800, it is large and apparently formidable. It is much, much larger than the empire ruled from Constantinople. But it is weak, because although you could call this the House of Islam, it is a house divided, and a house divided against itself. Baghdad, the new capital, has the obedience of a very small part of this orangey area. Most of it has broken up and is now a series of small, sometimes large emirates, sometimes at war with each other, sometimes in combination with outside powers against other emirates. The days when the Caliph himself could stand up and proclaim a holy war against the empire and expect every part of his dominions to contribute to this holy war are long past. The empire, on the other hand, is a compact and efficiently run state with a rising population and a recovering economy. Its borders with the Islamic world are increasingly peaceful, and when they are not peaceful, the balance of advantage is increasingly on the side of the empire. You might say, but if the empire is on the recovery and if Islam is in decline, how is it that we read every so often that another island is taken or another territory is raided and devastated? What about the loss of Italy right towards the end of this period in the 10th century itself? What about that? And the answer comes back that the empire suffers the occasional embarrassment, the occasional disastrous embarrassment in its conflicts with Islam, not because of structural weakness, but because of short-term incompetence. The empire's losses in its long drawn-out duel with Islam are now due to the personal incompetence of particular emperors or particular generals. No fundamental position from now on is lost, and any occasional losses are soon put right. There is a revival in the West as well. This is something that I don't want to cover in any detail. What we can say is that the barbarian invasions of the 5th century onwards were probably not catastrophic floods of people. It is more a matter of a set of political changes and the end of centralized Roman control. The new barbarian kingdoms established in Western Europe are soon converted to Catholicism. The spoken language of the people continues to be Latin, and classical Latin continues to be the language of culture and administration. The first centuries after this change of political master are chaotic, but this is not because the barbarians are painted savages who run around burning libraries. It is because of those climatic and demographic changes which have devastated much of the world. Not only the Mediterranean world, but also the Indian and the Chinese worlds. There is a general shrinkage throughout the world between, let's say, 500 and 800 within those periods. But just as there is a gradual recovery in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Empire, so there is a gradual recovery in the West. The first signs of recovery are in Italy, but there are signs of recovery outside Italy. You have the rise of a large Catholic Frankish kingdom, which is able to protect much of Western Europe from continuing barbarian raids. Of course, the Franks do not at first control Italy, and they never control Spain, but they do control France and a large and a growing area of Germany. The Franks are sufficiently well organised so that when in the 730s the Arabs begin to move north of the Pyrenees, hoping to do to France what they have done to Spain, they find for the first time in the West that there is a strong countervailing force. And you have the great Battle of Tours in 732, where the Arab menace to Western Europe is checked. It does not mean that the Arabs cease from coming across the Pyrenees and raiding. It does not mean all at once that those areas in southern France which have been taken over by the Arabs immediately revert to Christian rule, but it does mean that there will be no further Islamic expansion north of the Pyrenees, and that those expansions that have taken place will be reversed. In 749, the Pope declares Pepin, the son of Charles, the man who defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Tours, to be the king of the Franks, the king of all the Franks. This is the beginning of a new dynasty which conquers a very large part of Western Europe and which conquers deep into Germany. Bottom right on this slide, you see the Carolingian Empire, or you see the Empire of the Franks, or the Kingdom of the Franks, as it is around the year 750. But this is not simply a matter of a new and vigorous dynasty which is able to unite the Frankish barbarians under a single leadership and to protect those areas controlled from outside threats. There is also an economic and a cultural revival. The empire, or the kingdom of the Franks, is continuously expanded. If you look at this particular slide, you will see the empire of Charlemagne, the greatest of all the Frankish monarchs, 768 to 814. You can see that he has taken over northern and central Italy from the Lombards. He has conquered deep into Central Europe. Indeed, he has conquered the whole of Central Europe, and you can say that the border between his territory and the continuing pagan barbarians is now the border between Central and Eastern Europe. What else you can say is that there is a cultural and an economic revival. Here on the right, you have a page written out in what is called the Carolingian minuscule. This is a new alphabet, and it shows a number of fundamental changes from the writing of the later Romans. In the first place, you have a new alphabet. You have the introduction of lowercase letters. The old Roman capitals continue to be used, mainly for the spelling of names, or increasingly for marking the beginning of a sentence. You may also notice that words are now separated by spaces, and you may also notice that grammatical divisions within the sentence are now marked by various kinds of punctuation. This is a technological improvement on the various kinds of ancient writing. There is a long project which has been underway since before the reign of Charlemagne and which would continue after his reign, but which received much impetus during his reign from his own direct and interested patronage for the transfer of the surviving corpus of Roman literature from crumbling papyrus scrolls into parchment books. These parchment books, unlike papyrus rolls, last for many thousands of years. And if you are in the habit of looking through the introductions to classical texts, the ones written in Latin by the editors, you will see in most cases that the classical texts we have can be traced further and further and further back through patterns of manuscript transmission until about 800, before which we don't know what's going on with these manuscripts. Here are two of the great scholars of Western Europe during the reign of Charlemagne, Alcuin of York and Paul the Deacon. Here are some of the surviving architectural monuments of this Western revival. Here is the inner part of Aachen Cathedral. This was built around 800, and even if some of the marble decorations in this cathedral have been filched from Ravenna, you can see that the people who built this cathedral are not in any sense barbarians. There is a recovery. And here is Lorsch Abbey, rather strange looking building, and it's only part of the building as it would have been at the time, but again it is indisputable evidence of civilization in areas that the Romans themselves had regarded as the lands of barbarism. Here again you have Charlemagne. Now the importance of the Western revival is this. Charlemagne expands into Italy. In 751, the Lombards finally take Ravenna. That brings an end to imperial control of northern Italy. In 772, Pope Adrian I asks the Lombard king to hand over some cities from the former exarchate, from the former imperial territories in northern Italy. The deal between the papacy and the Lombards is that they will collaborate to force the Byzantines out of northern Italy, and they will share the spoils. Unfortunately, the Lombard king afterwards decides that he doesn't need to reward the Pope because, well, he doesn't need to. The Pope immediately writes north asking Charlemagne for help so that he can get his share of the booty. The Lombards, notwithstanding their recent expulsion of the exarch from Ravenna, write to Constantinople saying, if you thought we were a nuisance, you don't want the Franks in Italy, so why don't you send an army to shore up our defence? The emperor writes back saying, I'm otherwise occupied, but thank you very much. Short story is that Charlemagne invades, he takes over all of the Lombard kingdom in Italy. The Duchy of Benevento in the south, that is Lombard territory, but that remains formally independent. And south of Benevento, you have the continuing imperial areas of Italy. Those are left alone as well, but the areas of Italy taken over and ruled by the Lombard kings after 568, those are now incorporated into the empire of Charlemagne, or perhaps you might simply say that Charlemagne now declares himself to be the king of Italy as well as the king of the various other territories of his empire. 799, there is further trouble in Italy. The Pope gets into an argument with the Roman nobility. They turn on him, they try to seize him and to blind him. They attack him in the course of a religious procession and nearly kill him. The Pope takes shelter in one of the fortresses that he has in Rome and sends an emergency letter north asking Charlemagne, help, help. Charlemagne consults, comes south, enters Rome, sorts out the problems, and makes the Pope swear fealty to him as his feudal underling. The Pope doesn't like that. The Pope does not like to be regarded as anyone's man. He is the Pope, the supreme bishop, the universal bishop, the head of the church. He is not the feudal underling of some Frankish king. The Pope's response to this is that on Christmas Day, 800, Charlemagne is still in Rome, he's in St. Peter's, and the Pope is celebrating High Mass. Before Charlemagne can understand what's happening, and before he can do anything to stop it, the Pope creeps up behind him, sticks a crown on his head, and says, I crown you as the Roman Emperor. Charlemagne is in no position to take the crown off and laugh and say, Roman Emperor, don't be silly. He finds that he's been stuck with the title. Where does this fit in with the Byzantine revival? It fits in this way. Irene has remained a very successful regent, but by 788 her son is now no longer a boy, he's a young man. He's tired of being dominated by his mother. He doesn't want to be pushed around by mummy all the time. He's the emperor. He wants to be the emperor. So he stages a palace coup and he removes Irene and her advisors from power. It's just that Constantine VI lacks the abilities of his mother. He gets himself into a series of unlucky wars with the Bulgarians and the Caliphate. He is increasingly unpopular in Constantinople, and he finds that it's necessary to call his mother back and to call back some of her advisors and to share power. But there are continuing strains within the family. Irene is not interested in sharing power with her son, so in 797 She has Constantine arrested. The idea is that she'll blind him and put him into a monastery, but something goes wrong with the blinding and Constantine dies a few days later, which means that Irene has no choice. She can't marry a husband and make him emperor. You can't do that for the reason Elizabeth I wouldn't get married. So what she does is she casts aside the fig leaf of being a regent and she declares that she is the emperor. She's accepted as entirely legitimate within the territories of the empire. She's popular, everyone knows that she can do the job, and that's it. But in the West, there is outrage. A woman on the throne of the Caesars. And this is partly what causes the Pope to put the crown on Charlemagne's head, and this is partly what persuades Charlemagne not to take the crown off. Charlemagne has not been crowned Emperor of the West. He has been crowned the Roman Emperor. He is, as far as the Pope and Charlemagne himself is concerned, the Emperor of the whole of the Roman Empire. He is the successor not of Romulus Augustulus or of Valentinian III or of any of the Western emperors of the 5th century. He is the heir of Constantine and through him of Augustus, because as far as the Westerners are concerned, the East is without an emperor. It has a woman in Constantinople, but as far as they're concerned, she is ineligible to be the emperor, and therefore whoever is crowned emperor in the West is the emperor of the whole. This leads to diplomatic problems between East and West. The East regards Irene as the legitimate emperor. The West does not regard Irene as the legitimate emperor. The East does not regard Charlemagne and his successors as in any sense legitimate emperors. This is the beginning of a long-running dispute between East and West. It's also the beginning of a long-running saga that helps to shape Western history right up until the early 20th century. It is only under the Paris Peace Treaties of 1919 that the Pope is finally released from any requirement to seek endorsement from the Habsburg Emperor before becoming Pope. But that is another story. What matters is that Irene is now getting old. She is beginning to slip. She is no longer so effective a ruler as she had been. The idea is that she should marry Charlemagne. Charlemagne is quite old by now. Irene is in her 50s, which is old by the standards of the day. It is very unlikely that she will give birth to a child. It would have been interesting had she married Charlemagne and had the East and West been united even for a short time. But it wasn't to be because the marriage proposal came to nothing. In 802 there's a palace coup. She has overstepped convention by killing her son. She shouldn't have done that, and she finds that she has lost much popularity because of it. Her finance minister, Nicephorus, takes over. Irene is not killed. She retires to a nunnery on Lesbos, where she dies peacefully in 803 of, I believe, stomach cancer, but I'm not entirely sure. All I know is that she dies and she is buried. The importance of Irene is that she's set in place, but she certainly helped to set in place a series of internal and external policies that will restore the empire to supremacy within the Mediterranean world. And this is a supremacy that will continue for another 300 years nearly. But let's now skip forward. Irene may be regarded as the woman who sets in place all of the policies that allow the empire to recover. But if you go forward another 150 years, you can see, by looking at this red area, that the empire has staged a remarkable recovery. It has retaken all of Greece. Its control of southern Italy has been pushed far into the centre of the peninsula. It has also taken a substantial part of Syria. Antioch is now back within the empire. In 950, it was a serious possibility that the empire would decide to roll south. And had it done so, it would have retaken Jerusalem, it would possibly have retaken the whole of Syria, and it might easily have retaken Egypt. The reason the empire did not retake these territories is fairly simple. The Roman Empire of Augustus was perfectly viable as a multicultural empire. It was not necessary for all the peoples of that empire to speak the same language or to have the same religion, or indeed to have much in common at all, except to be subject to the emperor in Rome. By 950, the emperor in Constantinople is very doubtful of the long-term utility of taking over areas where very large numbers of people live who are not Greek-speaking Christians. The emperor had no particular interest in conquering territories that have substantial numbers of Muslims, because there is no easy way of assimilating them into the empire. Therefore, all further expansion by the empire is in the north and the west, conquering all the way up to the Danube and firming up the imperial dominions in southern Italy. And why bother reconquering? Egypt itself is now a satellite of the empire. Although Egypt, throughout its long engagement with the Mediterranean world, has been a very large net exporter of food, chiefly corn, by about 950, for various reasons that may have something to do with those climatic changes, it may not all be the effect of misgovernment, but for whatever reason, by about 950, Egypt is unable to feed itself and is on the edge of starvation. It is kept from starvation because the emperor is an ally of the Caliph in Alexandria, and the emperor, out of the goodness of his heart or from cold calculation, is keeping Egypt from starvation by large and continuing exports of corn from the Ukraine. Therefore, Egypt is within the imperial harem, and there is no point in conquering it. There's no point in sending an army to do what has been achieved in effect already. So this is the recovered empire, this red area. There is also a cultural revival within the empire. After about 600, the civilization of the Greek world goes into a long decline. The libraries continue to exist, filled with parchment books. There is no substantial loss of ancient literature. The only loss is of those people who are interested in reading it. The libraries continue to exist, but they are substantially empty for the next 150 years. But then, after about 800, you have the introduction of paper, you have the parallel introduction of a Greek equivalent of that cursive script I've mentioned for the West, and the introduction of punctuation and word spacing. You also have the recovery of education. It is possible to speak of the beginnings of a Byzantine recovery. I'll say more about this next week. Indeed, I suppose I can say a great deal more about this next week. Traditionally, we have seen the recovery of learning in the Byzantine Empire, or the recovery of learning in Constantinople, as an entirely positive sign, as further evidence of the empire's recovery and increasing glory. It is possible to take a more negative view of this, but as I said, I will have a look at this next week. The empire expands through the use of hard power, and I'll say more about this in a moment. But for the moment, let's look at soft power. This alphabet for the Slavs is, in the first instance, a failed experiment. It is a failed initiative, that's it. You see, in 862, Cyril and Methodius, Greek monks in Constantinople, are invited to Central Europe to convert the Slavs there to Orthodox Christianity. They go, and they find themselves in stiff competition with missionaries from Rome, especially since the Roman missionaries are backed by the Franks. But in spite of this, Cyril and Methodius have a great deal of initial success. And the grounds of their success are this. When the Roman Catholic missionaries move into an area, they convert, but they expect people to learn Latin because the Roman Catholic Church uses Latin as its liturgical and indeed its administrative language. The Catholics move into an area, the missionaries convert, they baptize, they build churches, and the churches then introduce the people to a Latin Bible and a Latin prayer book. The Orthodox, however, oddly enough, because this is a Greek initiative, and the Greeks traditionally have been so proud of their language and civilization that they will not learn other languages, but this is no longer the Greek world of antiquity. The Orthodox have a much more liberal view of language. They are perfectly happy to see Bible and the liturgy translated into the language of the people wherever they choose to convert. And so Cyril and Methodius develop a new alphabet for the Slavs. They oversee a translation of large parts of the Bible and of the key liturgical documents into Slavonic. There is the Glagolitic alphabet. It is the ancestor of the modern Cyrillic alphabet. In the short term, the influence of the Franks and of the Pope is too great. The Orthodox initiative in Central Europe comes to nothing. But that is not the end of the matter. 988. That is the conventional date given for the conversion of Russia. Of course, there had been a great deal of preceding and competing missionary activity by both the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, but it is in 988 that the Russians date their mass conversion to Christianity. Vladimir of Ukraine, sometimes called Saint Vladimir, sometimes called Vladimir the Damned. He's a pagan famed for cruelty and treachery, 800 concubines and several wives, and he spent most of his time, when not fighting wars against his neighbours, engaged in hunting and feasting. However, Vladimir is no fool. He can see the great benefits of a single religion to unite his people under his leadership. But there are three particular religions. You've got Christianity, you've got Islam, you've got Judaism. And it's not just Christianity, there's Catholic Christianity and Orthodox Christianity. So Vladimir sends out envoys to check over the various religions to find which one will be most suited to his people, or perhaps just more suited to him. They very quickly reject both Islam and Judaism because of the dietary prohibitions of pork. And of course, they reject Islam doubly because of the prohibition of alcohol. Temperance is no part of Vladimir's agenda for himself or for his people. So Judaism and Islam are ruled out. It's then a question of which flavour of Christianity. He writes a number of letters to the Pope. There is a long correspondence over whether wearing trousers is acceptable. Eventually, Vladimir chooses Orthodox Christianity because his envoys come back from Constantinople saying that they had been inside the great church in the city, and we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is no such splendour or beauty anywhere on earth. We cannot describe it to you. We only know that God dwells there among men, and that their service surpasses the worship of all other places. So that was it. Vladimir said, right, Orthodox Christianity it is. And there he is, presiding over the mass baptism of his entire nobility. They all had to strip off, jump in a lake, while they are converted en masse. That is the beginning of Orthodox Christianity in Russia. Until perhaps 30 years ago, we might have regarded this as a somewhat obscure act, and an act which had run its course now that Russia could no longer be described as a land of Orthodox Christianity. But it's not 30 years ago, and the conversion of Russia to Orthodox Christianity must once again be regarded as one of the key events of the Middle Ages. And here is a religious map of Europe in around 1054. Those orange areas, those are the areas which have been converted, sometimes only notionally, but those are the areas that have been converted to Western Catholic Christianity. And those blue areas are the ones which have been converted to Orthodoxy. There is a race between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches towards the North Pole, and for a long time it was doubtful as to which branch of Christianity would go furthest. But this is roughly how things stand in 1054. The importance of that large splash of blue in the north is this. On the one hand, the empire, as it looks north across the Black Sea, is no longer looking at a shifting mass of barbarian tribes. It is looking instead at a collection of Orthodox Christian kingdoms. Sometimes, for balance of power reasons, the empire will be at war with some of these Orthodox kingdoms, but mostly it is not at war with them, and these Orthodox Christian kingdoms, they look to Constantinople in exactly the same way as Catholics looked and look to Rome. It does not mean that the emperor is able to snap his fingers and bring a vast mass of armed soldiers from those northern areas to the defence of the empire. Sadly for the empire, that is never possible, but this is an expansion of the empire's soft power. The realms of Orthodox Christianity are no longer confined within the borders of the empire itself. Orthodox Christianity now stretches far beyond the borders of the empire, and it is possible to talk of a Byzantine Empire and also of a Byzantine Commonwealth. Hard power. The greatest of all the military emperors was Basil II, who reigned between 976 and 1025. He's the man who conquered vast swathes of territory in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. He expanded the empire to its greatest size since the disasters of the 7th century. He destroyed the independent Bulgarian kingdom and incorporated its whole territory within the empire. He cemented an alliance with Vladimir of Ukraine, the man who converted Russia to Christianity. Basil gave his sister in marriage to Vladimir in return for a military alliance. Poor sister, you might say. He also formed the Varangian Guard, a mercenary bodyguard recruited from Northern Europe that for a while included a large number of English mercenaries. And so here is the Byzantine Commonwealth at the beginning of the 11th century. And here again is the empire as it was at the death of Basil II in 1025. If you compare this with the empire ruled by Justinian or Constantine or Augustus, it is a pitiful fragment. It doesn't even include Rome. But it is the richest and most powerful territory in the Mediterranean world. It has solid, defensible borders. To the north, it has the Danube. The Black Sea is a Byzantine lake. North of the Black Sea, you have allied Orthodox kingdoms. The Byzantines control all the seas. They control the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. They hold Egypt as a satellite. The Arab kingdoms, the Arab Emirates in the south, are of no consequence whatsoever. In the east, the empire controls Armenia. It is surrounded by allies or by satellites. It is possible in 1025, the year that Basil II died, to look out at the world from the walls of Constantinople and to say that the vast tribulations that the empire has suffered during the past 500 years have come to an end, and indeed that history has come to an end. The empire is particularly favoured by God, because the emperor, of course, is the 13th apostle. God has now smiled upon the empire, and God will smile on the empire forever and ever. Everything has had a happy ending, and nothing can possibly go wrong. Except, of course, that it does, doesn't it? Everything does go wrong, and it goes wrong very quickly, and for a number of rather sad reasons. But that's something I will talk about next week. So that's all I have to say for this week about the recovery of the empire after its low point in the early Middle Ages. So let me turn off the slides and come back. We have a few minutes. Any comments or questions? I'm sure there are many things I could have said but didn't. There may indeed be things I have said that you don't agree with.